Hello and welcome to the post-mortem presentation of the Team Chobits game, Helios. Speaking will be Dean Fazio, Benjamin Jacob, Darren Gilks, Brad Meister, myself, Marcus Fletcher, and Cass Hemsley.
Like many games, the final product that is Helios started off as two very distinct and different ideas. The original concept, Helios, and Time Shift. While the initial ideas in Helios persisted through to completion, the original concept involved the players using three powers or lights, each of which had a specific effect on the player and surrounding world. The other game that the ideas of Helios were merged with was Time Shift. In this title, players use the Time Shift ability to travel back and forth between the past and present. Making changes to the past would drastically alter the future and allow the player to progress. By combining these two distinctive mechanics, we created a game by which the player had three different powers or lights. The green light, which allowed players to travel to the past. The blue light, which electrified the player, providing power to nearby objects. And the yellow light, which, remained a constant problem throughout development. Both of the ideas that were merged to form our final project were adventure platform puzzle games. The final storyline of Helios took place in the distant future and centered around a cyborg struggling to become more human than machine. The initial adventure was a journey through 10 three-part levels themed around environmental exploitation. Ultimately, the player character would attain transcendence at the top of a mountain. Gameplay featured puzzle solving, some Twitch platform action skills, and a lot of swapping between light powers to complete objectives. Our original level flow document had many diverse levels, including the water level, a level where all the player powers misbehaved, and an adventure game style town where the player solved a puzzle by talking to townspeople. As mentioned earlier, the main problem with the three light mechanics was balance. The third light, yellow, always felt a bit sluggish. The benefits of the other two lights seemed to far outweigh what the yellow light offered players. Even though it was the default light for progression, it always seemed to lack the appeal of switching to another, even with the negative side effects the players incurred.
To aid in our development process, we created a template level. The template level included a few basic necessities, such as lighting and a floor to begin building on, as well as all of our established Kismet sequences for the world swapping mechanic, level streaming, and the interaction of various objects such as conveyors and pressure pads. By simply plugging variables into the appropriate locations, designers could create a customized map with all of our core gameplay functionality very easily. To keep this process tight, we relied on a small handful of universal remote events, primarily tied to our world swapping mechanics, which we could then plug into any function we needed to perform. Our template level evolved over time with our game, and was invaluable in expediting the process when it came to building new levels, because designers did not have to work from memory or copy and paste from one level to another. To further streamline our process, we developed an art style that would allow us to get by without dedicated artists. By building most of our assets out of cubes or other simple shapes, we created what we coined the low-poly art style. This style gave our game a distinctive look, cartoonish and evocative, with chunky geometry and crisp textures. This decision also allowed us the benefits of simplified collision and improved engine performance. Textures were either created in GIMP or Photoshop or found online with Google Image Search and edited to work with UDK. By combining new textures with old meshes, we were able to turn old default assets into interesting new objects. Even with these time-saving measures in place, our game began to grow out of scope. Our struggle to define the yellow light and infuse it with fun caused our game to drift from an adventure puzzle platformer into more of an action game, with far-fleeing conveyor belts boosting and super jump abilities and walls that exploded on collision. We had planned out 10 three-part levels that followed a specific story arc. We wanted to enrich our story and designed a system for NPC interaction, but eventually had to scrap the system when we realized that even getting one custom character for the player would be difficult. Our original project had been ambitious to begin with, and this was not the game we had originally set out to make. It would end up requiring a lot of trimming to become a viable product again.
Since players were swapping between two worlds that featured unique obstacles and objects, we ran into a lot of collision detection and level design issues. Because players could freely swap between these two worlds, as the complexity of the level design became much more intricate, so did the issue of players getting stuck into objects. So As a way to alleviate this growing issue, the team decided to build around this problem and have it become a feature in the game. They implemented a vast array of analogs between both worlds so that the player could easily recognize when barriers or obstacles would be present in either world before they swap. This is also how our custom cat-pig hybrid, the Chio, came into existence. Originally just used as an analog to represent some moving objects, Chios quickly started to become the unofficial mascot for Helios. From their first appearance in one of our earlier builds of the game, the amount of positive feedback we received about them was pretty much a surprise to us. They were the right mixture of cute and odd that attracted players, so to utilize this newfound love and appreciation people had for the Chios, we decided to add them into the game with mechanics, story, and theme. Unfortunately, that same joy and excitement that the Chios brought into the game didn't seem to work out for our other core mechanics, the 3 light abilities. For a while, the yellow light mechanic was the least favorable out of the 3 lights, since it didn't give the player any substantial abilities, unlike the other 2 lights did. So the team decided to cut out the disadvantages associated with the light to make it feel more similar to the other 2. The restrictions on the player's mobility was taken out, and at last the yellow light started to become much more of an enjoyable mechanic to the player. But as luck would have it, the blue light took the role of the least favorable game mechanic and needed constant iteration. Seeing how much time and effort our core gameplay mechanics were taking to perfect, our team really had to reevaluate our game design.
After many late-night meetings and debates about the 3 light mechanic, we finally came to a conclusion that would change our game completely and become our biggest turning point in the design process. This turning point happened in our game when we decided to completely cut out the idea for the 3 lights. The 3 light mechanics weren't really clicking with each other the way that we had intended from the start. Cutting out this mechanic, we no longer had to worry about which light was the best and which light just wasn't quite fitting the game perfectly. This is when we decided to bring in the world swap. Whittling down to the swap between the mechanical world and the nature world made the designing of the puzzles much more simple and more enjoyable for the team. This led to drastic progress that we had been waiting on since the start of the design of Helios. With this turnaround, the game development process began to flow a lot more smoothly and made a lot more sense for everyone in the group. Before, we had to worry about working on a particular map for days because we had to worry about aligning a vision with 2 other lights and making one massive level. Not only did it take us entirely too long to make the levels, but it was also making the levels too big and just seemed to last way longer than they should. The world swap allowed us to then add the cause and effect factor to help with the way the puzzles were created and also helped to make them more interesting. With the world swap, the levels became much easier to design and could be done in a matter of hours, which also led to the levels being much more fun to play without the feeling of the level being drug out and too long. With time for level creation being drastically cut down, we were given much more time for playtesting. Now that we were on the right track, we decided to add the central pushing mechanic. Using the boxes to push and make it to platforms that weren't reachable without some type of help really gave the game a clear identity. It also gave us the idea to add different kinds of boxes to the games that would help you in different ways depending on the type of scenario that you were facing.
As part of the reformation process of Helios, we made the transition from large maps with several puzzle interactions to one-screen levels that contain several puzzle elements. As you can imagine, this helped to alleviate some of the ongoing issues we were having and, based on the feedback we received afterward, we were sure that it was a good decision. Some of the issues that we had involved both the camera and the use of terrain in our levels. The camera that we had before followed the player at a set distance with dynamic zooms that occurred when certain areas were reached and items of interest were encountered. Single-screen levels eliminated the need to do that, as all of the levels and the elements therein could be easily seen. As for terrain, at our stage of development at the time, we were going to add terrain much later. With our art style and the single-screen levels, however, we no longer required the fluidic, non-blocky style that the terrain would have brought to the table. The decision to make the transition to single-screen levels was not an easy one. It was a small part of a series of sacrifices we made to make our game the success that it is. As I said at the time, don't be afraid to throw stuff out. In the end, it served us immensely well. Another part of the reformation effort for Helios was the removal of the story elements. At the time, we were halfway through Final Project and we were all worried that the inclusion of the story element would take away from what was important, gameplay elements. It was a hard sacrifice at the time, but we eventually made it to the point where we were managing our time very well. Well enough, in fact, that we were able to reclaim much of the story that we had lost. Our experience with outside help was vastly mixed. While we weren't officially told that we would be provided with people to assist us, it was our understanding that we would have them made available to us. We were told that we would have art and sound people, and we eventually got art and sound people, as well as people called lab assistants, which we did not know we would have. Our experience with our art people was phenomenal, and our custom character came out very well. Our experience with our sound people, however, was not as good. While they managed to get all of our sounds to us, they did so at the beginning of the week of Final Project 3. We simply did not have the time to look through and implement the sound and music. The moral: communication. Had we coordinated better, our experience might have been much better.
One of the main mechanics in our game was our world transition, where the player was able to travel between two different points in time within the same game space. Our world transition mechanic went through various changes throughout the development process and ended up being not only the mechanic that defined our game, but also the one that we learned the most from due to all the different approaches we took to implement it into the game. We first started with simply hiding certain aspects in the game, depending on what point in time the player was in, and then changing collision if needed. This method ended up being a large performance drag due primarily to the level size, so we looked at using level streaming, which ended up causing a lot of bugs and being more hassle than what it was worth. So we began to look at material transition effects. We ended up testing a full screen effect along with a slow motion animation affecting the entire game space. We really liked the new direction, however we still battled with performance issues until we decided to overhaul our game design, which ended up including much smaller levels, thus improving performance. Our full screen material transition effect was applied to each object in the game world due to the fact that it was less distorting to the player and looked better. This allowed us to use less assets and less scripting, which improved our performance even more and made the mechanic look fantastic in terms of aesthetics. Throughout the development process, we are constantly pushed out of our comfort zone to try new things to better our game. Two examples that come to mind are the experience we had with our custom character and our game menus. Our game menus force us to not only learn new programs, but also learn how to manipulate UDK to allow players to use our menus. We spent countless hours learning Adobe Flash and Adobe Photoshop to design our menus. Adobe Flash presented a unique set of challenges to us in learning ActionScript to bring our menus to life inside of UDK. Once we were able to get our menus working in Adobe Flash, we looked at making them more aesthetically pleasing by creating custom assets for them inside of Adobe Photoshop. Our custom character was a very challenging task that really pushed us out of our comfort zones due to the fact that importing everything into UDK and bringing it to life was a task that none of us had ever done in any shape or form. We found ourselves having to create anim trees, anim sets, and physics assets, as well as exporting animations and models out of Maya and importing them into UDK. Finally, after we spent countless hours working on our custom character and menus, we were able to release our beta build and let loose a nice sigh of relief. Thank you for joining us as we took a look back at our game, Helios. We hope that you enjoyed the small glimpse into the journey that was our development process, and that it gave you insight into what the development process of a game can be like. We want to take this time to thank everyone that helped make Helios what it is today, and remind everyone that it's important to take what you've learned from the past and apply it towards bigger and better things in the future.